It was the autumn of 1987 when 29-year-old Claire Bouchard found herself the sole heir to 900 acres of Saskatchewan clay and a debt she hadn't chosen. The combine was sitting dead in the east field with a cracked head gasket. The grain auger had seized sometime in late August, and the well pump at the old barn was pulling air instead of water. Her husband, Rene, had loaded his half of the closet into a duffel bag on a Tuesday morning while the frost was still on the grass. He didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply said the farm was killing them both, and he was choosing not to be killed. The truck disappeared down the gravel road, and the sound of the engine faded into the wide, gray silence of the prairies. And then there was nothing, just the wind off the stubble fields and the distant creak of the old Bouchard barn settling into itself. Let me tell you about that silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that fills in around you like cold water, pressing into every corner of the life you thought you were building. There were unpaid invoices on the kitchen table, fuel bills, a parts account at the co-op in town, a seed loan that had rolled over from the spring. Claire stood at the window of the farmhouse her grandfather had built and looked out at the gray expanse of dormant land and understood, in a way she never had before, that the farm didn't care about her feelings. It had its own schedule, and harvest didn't wait for grief. Now let me explain the world she had inherited. The late 1980s were a strange and brutal time to be farming on the prairies. The decade had begun with the hangover from a borrowing binge. Land prices had been climbing through the 70s. Commodity prices had looked unbeatable, and the banks had leaned across their counters and practically begged farmers to take the money. Everyone was expanding. Everyone was buying the next quarter section, the next piece of equipment. The operating loans grew like summer weeds, and then all at once, the weather turned in every sense of the word. Interest rates had bitten hard earlier in the decade, and the echo of that crisis was still being felt in farm country. Commodity prices were soft. Claire's neighbors, good and decent people, had borrowed to get big and were now trying to figure out how to get smaller without losing everything. The Bouchard place was considered, quietly but persistently, a relic. Too small for modern production, too old in its methods, too stubborn in its owner, now that the owner was a woman alone. The morning after Renee left, Claire drove the old Chev pickup into Moose Creek. Her first stop was the Agricultural Credit Office, a low building beside the post office that smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional anxiety. Mr. Pollard, who had managed farm lending in that district for 15 years, was a careful man with a way of looking at you that told you he had already done the math before you sat down. He had known her father, Arthur Bouchard, and had respected him the way you respect a man who never needs anything from you. Now he folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with the expression of someone delivering a weather report they didn't cause. "Claire," he said, "I've been hearing things about Renee, about the combine." He paused to let the sentence breathe. "I want you to know the office is sympathetic to your situation, but the note on the equipment is due in March, and with the harvest incomplete." He let the implication hang in the air. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what unfinished harvests meant. He told her there was a land consolidation company out of Regina that was quietly buying up parcels. They were offering over market value. They would clear her accounts and leave her with enough to start over somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. He said the word easier with the kind of soft emphasis that was meant to sound like kindness. Claire looked at him across the desk for a long moment. Her hands, already roughened from the fall work she'd been doing alone for 2 weeks, rested in her lap without fidgeting. "The crop will come off," she said, "and the loans will be current by March." Mr. Pollard blinked. He uncrossed and recrossed his fingers. You can't run that harvest alone, Claire. The combine is down, and with the ground the way it is, you've got maybe 3 weeks before snow catches whatever's still standing. That's not a question of will. That's a question of math." She nodded once, as if she were absorbing information rather than being talked out of something. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and thanked him for his time. He watched her go with the face of a man who expected to see her back in that chair within the month. He didn't know who he was talking to. He was talking to the daughter of Arthur Bouchard. Her father was the kind of man who didn't say much, because everything he thought eventually showed up in the work. He had bought his last new tractor in 1961 and kept it running with the same focused patience he brought to everything. Reading weather, rotating crops, amending soil with materials his neighbors called old-fashioned. He had a saying he used when Claire was young, and frustrated with something broken or stuck or too heavy for her. The problem already knows the answer. You just have to be quiet long enough to hear it. She had rolled her eyes at this, the way children roll their eyes at their parents' aphorisms. She understood it now in her bones. Have you ever known someone who could look at a piece of equipment that everyone else had written off and see exactly what it needed? Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. That was Arthur Bouchard. He had taught Claire to read machinery the way some fathers teach their children to read music. Not from a book first, but from the thing itself. The sound of a diesel engine warming up told him which injector was dragging. The shimmy in a cultivator's frame told him which bolt had fatigued. He talked to Claire while he worked, that low, unhurried voice, narrating every step, every part number, every reason. She had been his helper from the time she was 9, handing tools in order from the tray of his chest, learning that the sequence of disassembly mattered as much as the reassembly. What he had left her was not complicated, but it was irreplaceable. The first was his toolbox, a green metal chest on casters, older than Claire herself, with every drawer organized by type and size, every tool in its defined space. It was, in its way, the most orderly thing on the farm. The second was a shelf of technical manuals, one for every piece of equipment that had ever worked the Bouchard acres, their spines soft and bent, their margins written in pencil with her father's observations. The third was a ledger, a green hardcover book, the kind sold in office supply stores in the 60s, in which Arthur had recorded every mechanical event on the farm since he'd taken over from his own father. Every repair, every part, every symptom and its cause, every fluid change, and the mileage at which it occurred. It was the institutional memory of a working farm, encoded in handwriting that was small and sure. That evening, instead of sitting in the house with the invoices, Claire went to the workshop. It was cold enough that her breath fogged under the single light bulb. The combine sat in the bay with its hood panels pulled back, looking like something that had been autopsied and not yet stitched. The head gasket failure had been Renee's diagnosis, delivered with the conclusive finality of someone who has already decided not to care. Claire pulled the green ledger from the shelf. She found the section on the combine, a 1974 machine that her father had acquired secondhand and rebuilt to his standards. She paged back through entries until she found what she was looking for. A note from the fall of 1981 documenting a similar overheating event, the subsequent gasket replacement, the part number sourced from a dealer in Saskatoon, and a hand-drawn diagram of the torque sequence for the head bolts. She looked at the diagram for a long time. Then she looked at the engine. It wasn't a catastrophe. It was a sequence of steps. She worked through the night on her knuckles split by the cold and by the edges of the cooling passages, laying each component out on clean burlap in the order it came off. By 4 a.m, she had the old gasket out and the mating surfaces cleaned. She drove to Scatoon the next day, found the part. It cost $46, and was back in the bay by afternoon. 2 days after that, she turned the key, listened to the engine come up through its warm-up cycle, and watched the temperature gauge settle into its normal range and hold there. The combine ran. The harvest that followed was the hardest thing she had ever done. She ran the machine herself, starting before light, finishing when she couldn't see the header anymore. The October cold came in hard that year, and she worked with hand warmers in her gloves and a thermos of tea in the cab. The grain was damp from an early frost, but it was still grade. She hauled it herself in the old tandem truck, made the runs to the elevator in town, watched the weights and grades get recorded, and drove back for another load. She slept 4 hours a night. She ate over the sink. Her neighbors saw her lights on at 11 o'clock and shook their heads and didn't say much, but the things they didn't say were loud enough. She finished the harvest 11 days before the snow came in for good. The months that followed tested her in different ways. The auger was the next problem. The seizure turned out to be a bearing failure at the lower end, which she diagnosed by rotating the tube by hand and feeling the catch exactly as her father had shown her. She ordered the bearing through the co-op, watched a YouTube video twice, then put the ledger's notes about the auger beside her on the workbench and replaced the bearing herself in a single afternoon. The well pump at the old barn required a different approach. She traded 3 days of helping her neighbor, Mr. Kowalchuk, fence his east pasture in exchange for his time and his pump-pulling equipment. She went back to the ledger again, found the specifications for the pump motor that her father had noted after a similar failure in 1976, and sourced a rebuilt unit through a dealer in Humboldt for less than half the cost of new. She was not spending money she didn't have. She was spending time and knowledge and the inheritance her father had actually left her. The winter was hard. The farmhouse, which was old and drafty, cost more to heat than she'd budgeted. She put plastic on the inside of the north-facing windows, the way her grandmother had done, and wore a sweater indoors and didn't turn the thermostat above 16. She drove to town twice a week instead of every day, combining errands. She took in some bookkeeping work for 2 local businesses, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with their receipts spread in front of her, earning the extra money she needed for the March note without touching the operating account. There was a night in January when it broke her, or tried to. A water line in the wall behind the kitchen ran through an exterior cavity that wasn't properly insulated, and on the coldest night of the year, -43 with the wind, which is the kind of cold that feels personal, that feels like it means something. The line froze and then cracked, and she woke to the sound of water moving somewhere it shouldn't be. She found the source at 2 in the morning, standing in her socks on cold linoleum in the weak light of a headlamp. And she turned off the main and sat down at the kitchen table with the water dripping its last and the weight of everything pressing down on her all at once. She thought about Mr. Pollard's office, the warm, carpeted quiet of it, the word easier. She sat there for a while. Then she got up and went to the workshop in her coat and her boots, because it was the only place she knew where things made sense in a way she could affect. She needed to feel her father's tools, the cold and precise weight of them, the specific gravity of things that worked. He had organized the top tray of his chest by hand tools and tucked into the space beside the wooden handle of his marking gauge. She found something she hadn't put there, a folded piece of paper, browned at the creases, with her name written on the outside in her father's handwriting. She stood there in the cold workshop and unfolded it. It said, "The land is patient. Be as patient as the land. When the work feels like too much, it only means you haven't found the next step yet. Find the next step." Love, Dad. She read it 3 times. She held it until the paper warmed in her hand and the cold stopped feeling so absolute. Then she went back inside, found her father's plumbing notes in the ledger. Because of course he had plumbing notes. Of course he had documented the pipe routing of the old farmhouse the way he had documented everything else. Located the cracked section and spent the next 4 hours repairing it with materials from the small supply of fittings he'd kept on the shelf above the chest freezer in the basement, organized in coffee cans by type. By morning, the water ran again. Her farming methods were her father's methods, which is to say, they were invisible to the casual observer and not well respected by the ones who cared about appearance. Arthur had practiced crop rotation on a 4-year cycle, had seeded winter rye as a cover crop on his harvested fields, had composted and returned organic material to the land in ways that the chemical salesman had always told him were inefficient. The neighbors, many of them, had gone to continuous cropping, maximum canola, and inputs that came out of plastic jugs with corporate logos. Their yields were higher in a good year. Their input costs were also higher, and their land, Claire could see it when she drove past, was beginning to look tired in a way that land looks when it's been pushed too hard. Her land didn't look tired. After 2 full seasons of working it herself, the soil on the Bouchard farm had a quality that she could feel when she walked the fields in the spring, when the frost was out and the ground had that particular give to it, that dark, alive texture that her father had called the farm's health. The earthworms were there. The residue was breaking down. The moisture was holding longer after a rain. Her yields were not spectacular, but they were steady, and her cost per bushel was consistently lower than what her neighbors were reporting at the coffee shop in town. She was not trying to win. She was trying to endure. In the farm economy of the late 1980s, those turned out to be the same thing. The first sign that things had shifted came in the spring of 1990 when a late frost took out a significant portion of the canola in the district. Farmers who were heavily leveraged into that single crop, who had borrowed to expand their seeded acres, were looking at numbers that didn't work. The banks started making calls. Mr. Pollard's office became a place where you saw people go in looking one way and come out looking another. Claire's canola was one part of a diversified rotation. The damage was real but not fatal. Her loans were small and current. She had no notes coming due that she couldn't service. She planted her spring wheat, then her barley, and watched the season come in. The following autumn, in October of 1990, Mr. Pollard drove out to the Bouchard farm unannounced. She was greasing the bearings on the header of the combine when his car came down the lane, a sedan that looked awkward on a gravel road. He got out slowly, as men do when they are visiting a place they treated incorrectly. He looked at the yard. The equipment was old, all of it, but it was clean and in its place. The fences were straight. The fields beyond were stubble brown, and even, which is the color of a properly harvested crop, there was order here of a kind that takes years to build. He stood by his car for a moment before walking over. Claire set down her grease gun and waited. "I drove by last week," he said, "when you were combining. I pulled over and watched for a while." He paused. "Your crop looked better than anything else I'd seen in the district all fall." "It was a decent year," Claire said. He shook his head. "It was a bad year for almost everyone else." He looked out at the fields again, then back at her. He took a breath that seemed to cost him something. "I was wrong, Claire. When you came into my office in '87, I was looking at the numbers on a page, and I saw a problem to be managed. I should have been looking at you and seeing your father's daughter." He met her eyes. Arthur always knew something the rest of us didn't quite believe. He thought the land was a relationship, not an investment, that if you treated it well, It would be loyal to you in ways that a bank account never could be." He paused. He was right. Claire wiped her hands on a shop rag. She didn't have a speech prepared because she wasn't the kind of person who prepared speeches. "He spent 30 years figuring that out," she said. "I just tried not to waste what he'd learned." Mr. Pollard extended his hand. She shook it, her palm still faintly marked with grease. It was a different kind of handshake than the one she might have gotten from him 3 years earlier. This one meant something. Several months after that, on an evening in the early spring of 1991, she heard a truck in the lane and went to the window and recognized it before she could see the driver's face. Renee's half-ton. She hadn't seen it in more than 3 years. He got out looking older than 3 years should make a person look. He'd been in Alberta, she'd heard. The oil patch, which had its own boom and bust rhythms and hadn't been kind to everyone who'd gone there, hoping to avoid the farm. He stood in the lane and looked at the yard the way a man looks at something he forfeited and can't stop thinking about. The combine was clean in the machine shed. The fences were tight. The house looked, if anything, more cared for than when he'd left it. Claire stepped out onto the porch. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "I heard things," he said finally. "In town. People talking." He stopped. "They said you were the only one around here who had a good 2 years, that you brought in crop when other people were walking away from theirs." He looked down at his hands. "They said it like it was some kind of miracle." She didn't answer. "It wasn't a miracle," he said. "Was it?" "No," she said. "It was my father's notebook." Renee nodded slowly, as though that were the answer he'd expected and the one he least deserved. "I called the farm a weight around your neck," he said. "I called your father's ways old-fashioned. I thought I was being practical." He looked at the yard again, at the whole quiet, working reality of it. "I was being afraid, and I made it your problem." He looked back at her. "I'm sorry, Claire, for leaving the way I did, and for everything I said before I left. I was wrong about all of it." It was the second apology she'd received in that year, and between them they laid to rest most of the ghosts that had taken up residence in the farmhouse since that Tuesday morning in 1987. She didn't invite him in. That wasn't where they were. But she stood on the porch and let the apology land. And she said she appreciated him coming, and she meant it. And when his truck was gone, she stood for a while in the quiet spring evening and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time. Let me take you forward now. 30 years past those difficult seasons. Claire Bouchard is not the young woman who fixed a combine head gasket at 4 in the morning. She is a woman in her 60s with silver in her hair and a way of walking the fields that looks like listening. The farm is still 900 acres. It has never been mortgaged for expansion and has never been offered to a consolidation company, and it shows in the soil structure, in the consistent yields, in the quiet, almost stubborn way it endures dry years and wet years and years when nothing goes right and still comes back. The farmhouse has a new roof and new insulation in the north wall. In the workshop, the green tool chest still sits on its casters, its drawers still organized in the order her father established, though Claire has added sections of her own, documented in a second ledger that sits beside the original on the shelf. The combine from 1974 gave way to a newer one purchased with cash in the late 90s, but it sits next to the old Bouchard equipment that was too well built and too historically useful to part with, and which Claire maintains still the way you maintain anything that represents someone you loved. Young farmers come to see her now. Not the ones from the agricultural colleges, necessarily, though some of those come too. The ones who seek her out tend to be the ones who are worried, who are looking at their debt-to-quit ratio late at night and feeling something close to what she felt in that kitchen in 1987. She doesn't tell them what to do. She shows them the ledger. She shows them how her father thought about the relationship between a machine and the person who runs it, between a field and the person who tends it. One afternoon last fall, she was in the workshop with her niece Paulette, 22 years old, and newly returned to the district after 2 years studying agriculture in Guelph. Paulette was looking at the ledger with the expression of someone who has studied theory and is now encountering practice for the first time. "Grandpa Arthur wrote all of this," she said. "Everything," Claire said. "From the day he took the farm over from his father, every repair, every part, every year." Paulette turned a page carefully. "It's like a conversation," she said, "with the farm." Claire looked at her. That was exactly the right word, and she hadn't expected it. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it is." She handed Paulette a wrench and pointed to the lower-bearing housing on the grain auger, which had developed a noise in September that Claire already knew the answer to, but wanted Paulette to find herself. "Before you start," she said, "just rotate the shaft by hand, nice and slow. Tell me what you feel." Paulette did. She rotated the shaft and frowned and rotated it again. "There's a catch," she said, "right there, about a quarter turn in." "That's the bearing," Claire said. "It's starting to go. You caught it before it seized. That means you get to replace it on your own terms, not the machine's." She looked at her niece. "Your great-grandfather would have done the same thing." He called it listening ahead. She crossed to the shelf and pulled down the second ledger, her own, and found the auger section and showed Paulette the part number and the supplier and the torque specification and the last 3 times the bearing had been replaced, and why, each one documented in Claire's own handwriting, building forward from where Arthur had left off. The people in the district, who had once spoken about the Bouchard place in the hushed tones of anticipated failure, don't speak about it that way anymore. The farm is talked about now the way things are talked about when they have outlasted every reason they were supposed to fail. It is a benchmark and a story and, in the way that particular pieces of land become, a kind of argument. The argument goes like this: the land doesn't care about your ambition. It doesn't care about your loan structure or your expansion plan or the size of your equipment. It cares about whether you know it, whether you respect it, whether you show up for it with patience and knowledge and hands that are willing to do the work. Arthur Bouchard knew this. He spent his life proving it, and then he wrote it all down in a green ledger and left it for his daughter, who proved it again. And now Paulette is learning to listen ahead. The work, as it turns out, is always the answer.